Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back again with another historical video. Today, we are moving on, continuing with imperialism, but we're looking more, now we're looking more towards the Caribbean and talking about Teddy Roosevelt and Taft once again. So let's get into it. All right. New American Diplomacy, Chapter 4, Lesson 3, New American Diplomacy. That was your warm-up, page 198. Objectives. We're going to discuss the open door policy and the countries involved. We're going to explain reasons why the construction of the Panama Canal was important to the United States. And we're going to show how President Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy was applied to U.S. foreign relations. All right, so we got some Japanese dubs. In 1894, war had broke out between China and Japan over the control of Korea, which used to be a part of China. European and American leaders thought China would easily win, biggest country in the world. Japan shocked the world by beating China with a more modern army. This treaty made the treaty that they accepted made China accept Korean independence and gave control over Manchuria to Japan and the important Port Arthur. This war showed that Japan had adopted Western technology and industry and showed that China was really weaker than expected. So influencing at its finest. Japan's rise in the world worried Russia. Russia didn't want them to have Manchuria because Manchuria borders Russia. Backed by France and Germany, Russia demanded part of Manchuria be given back to China. Then in 1898, Russia demanded that China lease that land back to Russia. Leasing the land meant it still belonged to China. However, a foreign government would maintain economic control overall. So Germany and France see what Russia just did, so they demand leaseholds in China too. Britain sees that, and they're like, we want the same. So these leaseholds became known as spheres of influence. Test question, spheres of influence, where a foreign nation controlled economic development in another country. So the events occurring in northern China worried the United States. Secretary of State, SOS, Secretary of State John Hay and President McKinley supported the idea of open door policy. Test question, where all countries should be allowed to trade with China. Hay will then send notes to other nations to not have them discriminate against the others who want to do business in their leasehold. So say France owns a piece of China and America wanted to trade with China, but it was in the sphere of France. These notes that the Secretary of State are sending are saying you can't discriminate against people who still want to do business and trade. So open door policy. So European and Japanese leaders accepted them, but refused to act until all the others agreed. And once all the big powers agreed, they declared the US and others do the same. So it's a lot of, who's who, and trying to figure out, let's get on the same page and not discriminate. So one party, one country doesn't overtake or doesn't get too powerful. So that's Secretary of State John Hay on the left, and that's, as we know, McKinley. And here's a political cartoon. As you see, all the different, it's very pixelated, sorry. Uncle Sam standing on China, and all the different countries are carving up a piece of China or cutting out a piece of China. All right, so the Boxer Rebellion. So with all these foreign countries debating on how China should be controlled. Secret society of Chinese nationalists formed to get rid of foreign power in their country. One such group were called the Boxers by Westerners, but when the name translated, it was the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. So boxer, boxing. In 1900, this group led to get rid of the foreign devils and their Christian converts who felt that they were corrupting the Chinese government. This became known as the Boxer Rebellion. They will attack foreign embassies, killing over 200 foreign officials and taking many others prisoner. And it all kind of tipped the balance when the German ambassador to China was killed. So a big international force, it was like 8 different countries, the United States, Britain, France, Austria-Hungary, Japan, and others all joined together to come in and protect their people, get their people out, and it'll squash the rebellion. Why is my picture not working? There we go. These are the Boxers. I Googled it, and this is the picture that I found the most intimidating. Total estimations during the Boxer Rebellion as a whole, a total of 136 Protestant missionaries, 53 children were killed, 47 Catholic priests and nuns, 30,000 Chinese Catholics, 2,000 Chinese Protestants, and between 200 to 400 of the total 700 Russian Orthodox Christians were killed in Beijing. So that's probably roughly over almost 40,000 people died. And this is a picture. Remember that Christianity was not an accepted religion over there, and they felt with foreign influence in China was corrupting Chinese government. Foreign influence, Western influence, and they did not like our religion. There you go. So here's a picture of the various countries that helped out to squash this rebellion. Open sesame again. So during this crisis, Secretary of State John Hay worked with British diplomats to persuade the other powers to not partition China. In a second set of open door notes, Hay convinced the participating powers to accept compensation from China for damages caused by the rebellion. So China is now going to have to pay these European powers for, damages. After some discussion, the powers agreed to not break up China into European-controlled colonies. Thank the Lord. That would have been a bigger mess in China. And the U.S. retained access to China's lucrative trade in tea, spices, and silk, and would gain a larger market for its own goods. Again, its sphere of influence. So election in 1900, William Jennings Bryan versus the incumbent, President McKinley. Bryan's anti-imperialist attitude and his attacks on the Republicans for their support of imperialism in Asia didn't help his cause at all. McKinley focused on the country's increased prosperity. Republicans promised the prosperity if they reelected McKinley. McKinley gets reelected. Theodore Roosevelt is chosen as his vice president. So shortly after the election, September 6, 1901, shortly after, about half a year later, McKinley was doing a meet and greet in Buffalo, New York. While greeting others, a gunman, Leon Zolgos, fired his gun twice and hit the president. Zolgos was a devout anarchist, someone who opposes all forms of government. 2 days later, McKinley died. Zolgos would be executed October 29, 1901. So less than a month, or about a month later, he was executed. Talk about fast-tracking these punishments. So Vice President Theodore Roosevelt became the next president. And that's how Teddy becomes president. Here's a representation of how he got shot. That's Leon Zolgos. All right, so 26th president. At the time, Teddy Roosevelt became the youngest president to enter office, 42 years young. He was chosen as McKinley's running mate because they knew of his powerful charisma and heroic war record would be a great asset. Republican leaders thought that the powerless job would also quiet his reform-minded attitude. Again, progressivism. And he will bring energy, enthusiasm to the presidency that was never seen before. And of course, as we know, he was a strong proponent of increasing American power abroad. He intended to make the country a world power and not sit idly by. That's Teddy. So he balanced his power. So Teddy supported open door policy. He prevented foreign nations from monopolizing there. This worry helped him prompt a treaty between Russia and Japan in 1905 in the Russo-Japanese War. Roosevelt convinced Russia to recognize Japanese gains in China and persuaded the Japanese to stop fighting and to seek more territorial gains. This action will help him win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. Years after, as relations between the USA and Japan worsened due to competition, they still managed to preserve Chinese independence, open door policy, ODP, and respect territorial gains in Eastern Asia, Eastern. So Teddy Roosevelt will send the Navy, the nicknamed Great White Fleet, across the world to showcase our naval might. They will stop off in Japan, and that's not going to really help relations that much. And here are the Great White Fleet, December 16, 1907 to February 22nd, 1909. I'm just reading a little writing. 16 battleships, 2 squadrons, and their escorts. These ships were painted gleaming white, which resulted in the armada being nicknamed the Great White Fleet. All right, speak softly and carry a big stick. So Teddy Roosevelt believed that displaying U.S. power to the world would deter nations from fighting. This big stick policy was most prevalent in the Caribbean. It was your book says it's a Western African phrase, speak softly and carry a big stick. The most dramatic acquisition was of the Panama Canal Zone to build a canal through Panama to easily transport from the Pacific Ocean to the Caribbean. It would save time and money. So in 1889, a French company had abandoned its efforts to build such a canal, and new interest in the canal will force a new treaty to be discussed between the French and the Americans. It's called the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, Faute. And it will give exclusive rights for the USA to build a canal through Central America. So if before the canal was even built, if you wanted to send goods from New York to San Francisco and you couldn't do it by train, they would ship it all the way across down South America and all the way up to San Francisco. Now with the Panama Canal being built, the zone goes right through here, and it cut it off, and it's about 13,000 miles to 5.2 miles, 5.2K miles. Panama. Hopefully you guys know that song. Anyways, Panama opposed Colombian rule. They used to be a part of Colombia once before. In 1903, the U.S. offered Colombia a large sum of money and yearly rent for the right to build the canal and to control the narrow strip of land on either side of it. France had, again, once tried to build it, but they failed miserably. And at the time, the U.S., since they were competing against the French, they tried to build one through Nicaragua, and it wasn't looking good. So, fearful of losing commercial benefits, French and Panamanian officials, the only way to build the canal was to declare independence and make their own deal with the United States. So, French official Philippe Bunau-Varilla will organize a small revolt. November 3rd, they revolted. Teddy Roosevelt will send ships to prevent Colombian interference and will recognize their independence. 2 weeks later, both countries signed a treaty for the canal to be built. Test question. That might be a short answer question on your midterm, on your test. So here's the cut. So the Caribbean Sea right here. and the canal goes all the way through here. It's about 51 miles. Before the canal was built, ships from New York to San Francisco traveled 12,000 miles. With the canal being built, it's cut in half, 4,900 miles. Panama's geography made it difficult because the center of the country is much higher than sea level. So engineers had to build a series of lakes and concrete locks to raise and lower ships as they traveled the 51-mile canal. They also built a dam to create an artificial lake, Lake Gatun, in the center of Panama. During the construction, malaria and yellow fever slowed workers down. The U.S. Army Surgeon General inspected and maintained control over potential breeding places of these mosquitoes so that they could allow work to continue. The canal would be finished 1914. And here's the build. All right, Big Brother. Test question. In the early 1900s, American officials became concerned with the large debts Latin American countries owed European banks. For example, Venezuela defaulted on its debts, so Britain, Germany, and Italy blockaded Venezuelan ports until they got their money. The crisis was resolved peacefully after the United States pressed both sides to reach an agreement. So Teddy expanded his big stick policy due to heightened involvement abroad. He will give a speech later nicknamed the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And a corollary is kind of like an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. Remember the Monroe Doctrine? Hopefully you remember the Monroe Doctrine. Maybe that's probably going to be on your test too. The Monroe Doctrine said that the American continents were no longer open for colonization, remember? So now the Roosevelt Corollary is this extension. So it is to prevent European nations from sending troops to the Caribbean and Central America, as the U.S. would intervene in LA, Latin American affairs to maintain its stability. Also, to allow us, our country, to influence more of Central and South America. So this is Teddy Roosevelt walking through the Caribbean Sea, and he's pulling along his Great White Fleet, debt collectors, sheriff, the receiver, and it's got Mexico, Panama, Venezuela, Santo Domingo. No debt, no problem. So the goal of the Roosevelt Corollary was to prevent European powers from using the debt problems of Latin American countries to justify intervening in the region. The U.S. first supplied the Roosevelt Corollary in the Dominican Republic when the Dominican fell behind on its debt payments to European nations. In 1905, the U.S. began collecting custom tariffs in the Dominican Republic and using the Marine Corps as its agent. $1 in a dream. So Teddy Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, placed less emphasis on military force and more on economic development. Taft believed that supporting Latin American industry would increase trade and profits for American businesses and to lift American countries out of poverty and social disorder. And this is called dollar diplomacy. So to give Europeans less reason to intervene in Latin American affairs, Taft's administration worked to replace European loans with loans from American banks. 1911, American bankers began making loans to Nicaragua to support its shaky government. A year later, civil unrest forced Nicaragua's president to ask for greater assistance. The U.S. Marines entered Nicaragua, replaced their customs collector with an American agent, formed a committee to control customs commissions. The U.S. would support this government and customs until 1933. So here's President Taft's dollar diplomacy. Wink, wink. And he's really holding Teddy's big stick. And he's got U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, AT&T, U.S. Rubber. Go invest in Latin America with the full faith of the U.S. government and its military. New Prez, same stuff. Woodrow Wilson, remember, replaces Teddy Roosevelt and not replaces Teddy, replaces Taft. He had experience in and much more interest in domestic policy. Woodrow Wilson opposed imperialism. He believed that democracy was essential to a nation's stability and prosperity, and so he wanted to promote U.S. democracy to create a world free of revolution and war. Oh boy, how ironic. He hoped the US would lead by a moral example, but his first international crisis thwarted that hope. Oh, I didn't put a title. Title it Mexico. So for more than 30 years, Porfirio Diaz ruled Mexico as a dictator. During Diaz's reign, Mexico became a much more industrialized nation, but foreign investors owned the new railroads and factories that were built there. Mexican citizens remained poor and landless. So by 1910, discontent opened up into revolution. You have a guy named Francisco Madero, who was a reformer, who seemed to support democracy, constitutional government, and land reform, led this revolution. However, Madero would be an unskilled administrator, and in 1913, General Victoriano Huerta would seize power and Madero would be murdered. So they kind of trade one dictator for another dictator. So here's Porfirio Diaz, here is Madero, and there is Huerta. Recognition. So Huerta's brutality repulsed Wilson, who refused to recognize this new government. Instead, Wilson announced a new policy. In order to win U.S. recognition, groups that seize power in Latin America would have to establish a government based on law, not on force. Wilson believed that without the U.S. support, Huerta would be overthrown. Meanwhile, Woodrow Wilson ordered the Navy to intercept arms shipments to Huerta's government and permitted Americans to arm Huerta's opponents. And there's Woodrow Wilson saying, no, no, no. This is probably would be considered racist today, but this is how they represented the Mexican government. That's sad. All right, more Mexico. April 1914, American sailors visiting Tampico were arrested for entering a restricted area. After their release, their commander demanded an apology. The Mexicans refused. Wilson saw the refusal as an opportunity to overthrow Huerta. Soon after, Congress will authorize U.S. To go by force. When Woodrow Wilson learned that a German ship was unloading weapons at the Mexican port of Veracruz, Wilson immediately ordered American warships to Veracruz, where U.S. Marines forcibly seized the city. Although the president expected the Mexican people to welcome his action, anti-American riots broke out. Wilson then accepted international mediation to settle the dispute, and I can't say this name, Venustiano Carranza, whose force acquired arms from the U.S., would become Mexico's next president. And that's Carranza. Pancho. So Mexican forces opposed Carranza, so they will conduct raids in the U.S., hoping to force Wilson to intervene. March 1916, Pancho Villa and a group of guerrillas will burn down the town of Columbus, New Mexico, killing 17 Americans. Wilson responded by sending 5,800 troops under General John J. Pershing across the border to find and capture Villa. This expedition would be a very unsuccessful journey. That's Pancho Villa. So morality. So Wilson's Mexican policy damaged U.S. foreign relations. The British ridiculed the president's attempt to shoot the Mexicans into self-government. Latin Americans regarded his moral diplomacy as no improvement over Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. In fact, Woodrow Wilson followed Teddy Roosevelt's example in the Caribbean. He negotiated exclusive rights for naval bases and a canal in Nicaragua. In 1915, he sent the Marines to Haiti to put down a rebellion. In 1916, he sent troops to the Dominican to set up a new government there that he would hope be more stable and democratic than the current regime. And that concludes chapter 4. And I don't have a book. Hold on. All right. So hopefully you guys did enjoy that. I know it's a little bit longer, with a little bit more writing, but this is how we're starting to move towards American influence in the area, and the stuff that is happening at this moment of you taking notes is going to help set up a good background for when the Cold War comes a knocking. All right, so your homework is page 201, 2 through 4. All right, if you guys did enjoy that, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.